Hello, this is Perspectivas Latinas, a community service of CAN TV. I'm your host, Juan Carlos Hernandez. Today, our guest is Hipolito Roldan, one of the most important figures in Chicago's housing sector. He heads the Hispanic Housing Development Corporation, which has helped lead the creation of affordable housing in many of the city's Latino neighborhoods since the 1970s. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Juan.
Great. Let's start off by talking about the history of this organization, how it was formed, and eventually how you made your way to it.
Well, it was 40 years ago next year that the organization was formed by a group of Latino civic leaders, religious leaders, community organizers. Back then, Governor Walker was in office, and he received a group of protesting activists, Latino from the north and south side of the city, who complained about the fact there was no housing being built in Latino communities back then. He then proceeded to out of that meeting, create a committee that ultimately led to the formation of Hispanic Housing, a group that would operate citywide, but within Latino communities.
So there was no construction of housing, you said?
Well, there were federal dollars flowing in through the state and through the city, but really nothing. There was nothing being built in Latino neighborhoods. The capital, the expertise, and the planning experience to develop affordable housing in communities just didn't exist at the time. Certainly, people in the community understood what their problems were, but they didn't have the mechanism to deal, to find a solution for those problems.
So these community activists come together and they protest, and that's eventually the governor had to listen. Did the mayor listen as well, or what happened then?
First the governor listened, and they, we got started with a $145,000 grant from the Illinois Housing Development Authority, IDA.
Okay.
So that was the seed capital that got us started back then, and then as we began to actually develop properties, then the city, the mayors, sort of have worked through about 4 mayors or so now. Daley certainly has been the longest.
Right.
But this is important work that you see the product of your work in very real ways, not only with property and buildings, but with families and elderly people moving in and living in decently. Okay.
So, but you're not from. Now your name, I think, is pretty much synonymous with this organization. You've been at it so long, but you're not from Chicago. What brought you to Chicago, and how did you end up at this organization?
Right. Well, you're here in Brooklyn still after all these years, and what brought me here is that I got 2 degrees at night over about a 10-year period while I worked during the day for a community development corporation in Brooklyn, and getting my master's degree, I sort of wanted to actually run something myself. I was an assistant director for a community development corporation in Brooklyn, and started sending out resumes all over the country, and wound up getting an interview for what was leadership of this newly created organization. And so after a couple of interviews with people like Reverend Daniel Alvarez, a number of others who are still around somewhat, I got the job, and arrived filled with expectations and enthusiasm about getting the work done. I remember I had this room in a larger office that I was renting, and had a mirror in front of it, and that was the only feedback I got, because when you're sort of in a dark room looking for a switch, you'd like to have some advice, but there was none to be had. So it was really it was a difficult time of great doubt, if you will, for me.
Right. How did you, I'm curious, how did you work through some of that? Did you find some mentors that helped you along there?
Yeah, there was actually, the office that I was in was a consultant that had worked with the State Housing Finance Agency. And the name of it was Technical Assistance Corporation for Housing, a guy named Ralph Brown, who's still doing this kind of work. And Ralph was truly not only a mentor, but a good friend that kept me from going off a lot of cliffs. So I appreciated that.
That's great. And then you're here, you're in a dark room, as you said. And what were the first projects you said, we really need to do this. We need to respond to the cries from the community, because they were cries, there were protests, and we just need to do this now. And how was that experience?
Yeah. Well, our very first project was in Logan Square, where Reverend Alvarez, was running Casa Central. A number of facilities of Casa Central were in Logan Square. And about a block away from where he had a nursing facility, there was a large courtyard building that had been deemed by back then Alderman Mell, to be derelict and was scheduled for demolition. This is a 72-unit, just gorgeous building, really on its last legs in terms of systems, but it was like a pyramid. These buildings are 4 courses of brick. They'll stand forever.
Wow.
So, Dan began to organize, a movement there to get that building salvaged and do the whole rest of the block south of that, which was a group of buildings that were in very, very bad shape and, occupied by street gang. A lot of the buildings were empty. A lot of the apartments were empty and vacant. So we were able to persuade Alderman Mell to pull it out of demolition court and put together a 160-unit project out of 6 buildings on a project that went from Dickens to Palmer, that whole east side of the block along Kedzie Avenue there. So that was our very first project. That project was obviously too big for Hispanic Housing and me to do. So what I did was, I used about $20,000 to option up the right to purchase these properties for 6 months. That's how I got control over these buildings. Wow. And then, with a good pair of sneakers, ran around and tried to find a partner who really understood how to develop properties, what we were trying to do, but also had the capital and the experience that would allow us to go to our financing sources. So we formed a joint venture. But I had the leverage of having the land with which to joint venture, even though we didn't have the capital or the experience. So that's how we hit the ground, with really somebody else's dough and somebody else's experience.
Right. And how were those days? I mean, you said you had sneakers and you're running around, and you secure this land, you find the partner, and then the renovation, the remodeling starts on all of these properties. Tell me about how that felt and what it was day to day, and how that carried you on to your next project. And actually, I do want to talk about how that helped shape the neighborhood. But let's answer my first question, please.
Well, it's interesting that back, 38 years ago, Logan Square, which is, by the way, over the last 4 or 5 years, one of the hottest hipster communities in the city.
Definitely.
Back then, there was a lot of doubt as to whether the community was going to go down the drain or not. There were a lot of large vacant buildings. People were concerned about a lot of gang activity. And of course, then there were these gracious mansions where, some pretty wealthy people were living in. So there was the struggle between what the future of this community was going to be. These larger properties along the boulevard, by the way, which is a historic boulevard designed by Dan Burnham and Frederick Law Olmsted. So these larger properties, in a sense, symbolized, for better or worse, where the community was going. To the extent that they were allowed to decay or torn down, we were losing that fight.
Right.
So, so that large property, it was only 160 units in a large community, but because it was on Kedzie, on one of the major boulevards, sent a powerful message about the city caring, people wanting to invest money, taking risks to bring the neighborhood back. We did about 3 or 4 other projects in Logan Square, right behind that. Some larger ones, and then some smaller for sale projects.
After that first project.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So in a sense, it began, a sort of turnaround, an attitudinal turnaround in the community to keep people, hey, there's going to be something happening here. Let's not sell our brownstone and head off to the suburbs.
Right. And for you, it was, I guess, a moment of not being in that dark room, but I guess seeing some light.
Yeah. No, this is a slow sort of revelation, not an instantaneous one, but one that began to, show the way of what the art of the possible was in terms of being able to do things in communities. So it was a lot of fun. And I had some experience of doing this kind of work back in Brooklyn as well.
Right, definitely. Yeah, certainly. But one thing that strikes me, and I think it's incredibly true, you say it in some of the interviews I read that you've given before to other organizations. We tend to think that cities are formed by downtown or by huge historical figures. Like you mentioned, Burnham, and certainly his weight will carry on through perpetuity in this city. But you said something interesting. Neighborhoods form cities. Tell me why you say that and why you believe it so deeply.
Well, it's actually, throughout history, the concentration of sometimes, the religious community, but also the economy, employment, educational institutions, all of this sort of concentrates in cities at one time for defense as well.
Right.
But the fact of the matter is that cities are, to a great extent, the place where, the primary social unit, the family, can be allowed to thrive and prosper and grow in a sort of agrarian, way.
Right.
So given, where the planet has moved to, cities, in my opinion, have become more and more important. And if you look at, some urban visionaries and planners, I mean, the future of the planet is going to have incredible growth in cities, enormous density, and how we deal with that concentration of people and how we sort of spread the wealth there is, I think, the challenge for us going forward. So, I think to a great extent, the measure of a community that is doing well is a place where children that grow up there want to continue to live there and have the financial capacity to be able to live there. That, to me, is the ideal community because, of course, then it sort of transcends, generation to generation.
Definitely. And you mentioned two things, children that grow up in a certain community wanting to remain there and having the resources to do it, but also how does a society ensure that the wealth is spread around in a community? How do you think housing plays a role in that, or because especially in large cities, and you talk about the world being shaped by cities, one of the big problems we see in a lot of cities is affordable housing, but also recently here in the United States is foreclosure. Those two crucial questions that people without a whole lot of means face constantly. So how do you think as a society and as an organization could you respond to that? Can we respond to that as a whole?
Yeah, well, the foreclosure problem was, and this downturn, unprecedented in the economy that we had starting like 2007 or so, devastated the Latino community nationally. I mean, it was at almost those precise years that Latinos, in a massive way, were getting into home ownership, actualizing their dream, moving on up into the economy. And so they were the sort of last in to this great American housing boom that was, to a certain extent, an illusion, not really based on real economic value. And so as, the economy turned down and a lot of value, literally trillions of dollars in housing value, were lost in this country during the last 7 or 8 years or so. And Latinos represented a huge part of that. The Pew Charitable Trust had a report a couple of years ago, that the Latino community in America lost about 60% of its net worth.
60%?
About 60% during that time because most of it was housing equity. And that sort of like disappeared. So that's been a major problem. There is now, I think, in neighborhoods throughout the country, certainly Miami is coming, which was one of the epicenters of foreclosures, has now come back pretty dramatically. Las Vegas has as well. Chicago, I think, certain neighborhoods are starting to see some light in the tunnel and all of that. But it's been devastating for families. I mean, some families will probably, be what I call permanent renters now, permanent for the next 10 years, be renting because of, the economy, that they're terrified to buy anything again, that they can't finance anything again because they went bankrupt, for a lot of reasons. And it's, it's devastating. It's been devastating to us.
So, and you mentioned a word that a lot of the value of some of these properties was was false. And now that we're, I guess, coming to the other side of it, how can people protect themselves, and how can organizations such as yours help inform people or help them in that process of securing the value of what they buy and holding on to it?
Yeah, well, the one of the problems that existed that in part precipitated this downturn is that there were appraisals of property that were being made that were not based on real value. People who were making, very, very little, somebody making $20,000 a year buying a $400,000 home just doesn't make it. But people were being qualified to buy property.
Wow.
The theory of these people who were in the financial community at the time was that if you got somebody to buy a home, you got fees. And if they didn't make it, well, that's okay, because the property would appreciate in value in any case. So there would just be another family step up to pay for it. Now that was a false theory, obviously, and we all know that now. But the fact is that they didn't care whether families got devastated because they couldn't pay increasingly, larger amounts of their income to debt service. So now we have a mechanism. We've gone back to the past, where we were really appraising property based on real economic criteria. We're asking for a real, down payment, and I think things are back to where they need to be, to begin again the process of putting families in housing that they can afford.
That's awesome, because I often hear people say, and I read. It's the market. The market is determining this. The market is doing that. The market forces, as if it were something supernatural, something out of our hands. But as you said, there are now regulations and steps to follow when somebody is seeking to buy a home.
Yeah, I mean, you need to remember that that this downturn in the economy and the foreclosure problem in America is just enormous and held back the economy for about 3 or 4 years in a major way.
Right.
And it was not only properties and homes that were sort of closed up and boarded up. Families were devastated. Banks had their entire sort of real estate portfolios go underwater.
Right.
Even though they were good loans when they made them, because what was worth $200,000 was now worth $125,000, and it just, the equity was not there. So this downturn has been devastating for real estate lawyers, architects, builders, general contractors, you name it. A lot of people have gotten hit.
Right. And how did your organization, I guess, surf through those waves of change? I mean, they could have very easily, for I think a lot of organizations, been such a struggle that maybe they never made it through. But your organization is still here.
Yeah. We are. We're developing on a number of fronts. One of them is rental housing, using a number of financing sources from the federal government, banks like that. So that's one piece. That was not necessarily affected by the downturn in the economy, but certainly the capacity to borrow money was that influenced it greatly. We also were involved in for sale housing, and we got devastated there, and we sustained substantial losses in that part of our business. We also manage about 4,400 apartments, about 13,000 people. That continued to go, and that had enormous demand for the affordable, high quality housing that we had. So we've got different aspects of it. We have a construction company as well. And during this time, it was a little tougher to find work, because there was just no work to be had out there, except maybe our own work. So we managed to sort of get past that.
And it's admirable that you're still here and offering Latinos a door into a good rental property or home ownership. And how does a family go about seeking your advice, your help in the whole process of maybe renting a home or purchasing one?
Yeah. They can just give us a call or get onto our website. We have a receptionist that will channel the family to either someone who is elderly and looking to rent a place, or a young couple that may be looking to buy something in the immediate future, or we recently got a grant from the Attorney General, Lisa Madigan, on this sort of robo-signing settlement that occurred a couple of years ago. So we got a $3 million grant. We're going to borrow another $3 million, so we're going to buy $6 million worth of foreclosed homes in Belmont, Cragen, and Hermosa. And we're going to be renting them out, not selling them. So we're going to be renting them to families, who, 7 years ago would be actually buying homes.
Right.
I mean, one of the problems that we have is that this enormous demographic of home buying families, not only Latino, African American, came to a screeching halt and has, been there for a while. I mean, some people there's a huge demographic that's there waiting and now looking to rent within the market. And for the most part, rentals within the market are one-bedroom apartments, a few twos, but really not family-size housing.
That's true.
So these foreclosed homes, 3- and 4-bedroom, 2-bath homes, represent an opportunity to properly fit housing, for families that are out there and would be buying in the near future.
Okay, and the people that came to the screeching halt, is it because maybe they're not earning as much? Is it because they're out of work? Or,
it was, I think, the perfect storm, a convergence of events. One, this precipitous economic downturn. What was worth $250,000 is now worth, $175. But is it going to be worth $100, 2 months from now? So I'm not going to buy. Second thing is the banks realize, we can't do, 100% loans, because it's, everything's underwater,
Right.
So we really need to, get some equity up front. So if you wanted to buy a $200,000 home and you needed $25,000 in cash, 25% down, or even $15,000 in cash, that's a lot of money for families to save, to put down, So it sort of very narrowed the market. The other aspect of it was what I call consumer terror. People were terrified to buy anything bigger than a bread box because the economy was terrible. And it just wasn't happening. And then, of course, the financing part of it as well was very, very difficult. The banks didn't want to make loans when, the whole housing market was going down the drain.
Right. So in the place of that, your organization has responded by, well, like you said, you're going to help create these rental properties for entire families.
Yeah.
Right.
And the long-term thought within 3 or 4 years is that we would sell these houses to actually families who are living there if they can get back on their economic feet and want to buy. So the idea is to give people some breathing room by simply renting and then really wind up selling these homes to these families.
Wow, that sounds like a great plan, and certainly a very intelligent response to what's going on in society and the difficulties families are facing.
And the problem with foreclosures, another what I think is a huge problem with foreclosures is, that they're highly visible, boarded up homes.
Right.
A home which is the symbol of American wealth in this country, sitting there boarded up, sending a message to that person who owns a house down the block or maybe on that block. You better get out of here before it's too late. It's a very dangerous ball when it gets rolling, and it's hard to stop, once it gets rolling as well. So it's something, getting a family into these homes, whether they own or whether they rent, is, I think, part of the purpose that we're trying to carry out with this program.
Definitely. Also curious, you have an advanced degree in urban planning, correct?
Right.
And we're talking about getting the community into these homes. How do you get young people into this profession and encourage them? Because I think the sense of thinking, the thinking about urban planning is, well, that's pretty dry, or that's not a career I want to think about. Although certainly you're telling us that it's not, and it's certainly the life of a city revolves around the plans that are being made. How do you encourage young people to come into this and stay there and get excited about something that has such a huge impact on our lives?
It's a really good question because, I received this award from the MacArthur Fellow, through really no fault of my own, almost by accident. I don't know, frankly, how it happened. Point is, they give you money, and you don't have to report or anything. And so
tax-free?
No, we have to pay taxes on it, but it was, it keeps coming. And so it was actually my wife's idea, who was actually she's about a year smarter than me.
Okay.
She tells me things, and I always question what she's talking about. Then I realize how brilliant it was a year later. But she came up with the idea of starting this scholarship for young people, and it really had been in the back of my head because I would get calls from headhunters all over the country looking for a warm, brown body for a job somewhere, in San Antonio or New York,
Right.
and it would be hard pressed. Occasionally, I had a resume of somebody, and I sort of through the quirk of fate found people jobs, but I thought, let me grow them. Let me form a scholarship program, mentor them, show them what this field is about, and really, create my own young people who are in this field. The problem was exactly what you're talking about. Young people know what a doctor or a lawyer is, a poet, but they don't know what a community planner or a housing developer. This is too exotic and esoteric for people. Because basically we become what our cousins or uncles or fathers, like that. That's the sort of career connection, is what young people see in their lives. So that was part of the challenge as we formed the scholarship fund, and then. I had to meet with a lot of young people, to explain what this was, take them out on a bus, show them this little old lady living very happily with friends and people she hated in the building that made her come alive, all of that. And so, that was a way that we got this scholarship fund going that we have now at Roosevelt University in their real estate department.
So it's at Roosevelt?
Yeah.
Okay.
We had it at the University of Illinois, and it's been at Roosevelt for about 8 or 9 years now. We've had about 16 young people get their graduate degrees and are now out there in the field and all of that.
And what have you heard from these folks that have come and through and done a master's degree in urban planning? What have they told you about their experience and what they've contributed?
Well, my message to that, first, some of them are in the private sector. Some of them are working for us, actually. 2 of them are working for Hispanic Housing. But, the problem is, that this enormous field of, real estate, whether you're a broker, a developer, a banker financing things, a bureaucrat, there are hardly any Latinos in this field to speak of. And I think that's the challenge, is to begin focusing our youth on this area as a field where they can do very well for themselves and do important work as well, service.
Right.
So that was, one of the initial challenges, that we faced. But going forward, I think, it is a mechanism that when you look at, where you came from in a community, you can really, it's an incredible tool to physically, psychologically, economically, change the direction from worse to better in that community by dedicating yourself to the work. So to me, it's an incredibly exciting field to be in.
Most definitely. And thank you so much for sharing this time.
Time's up.
Yeah, time is up.
I'm going to stay. Thank you so much, Juan Carlos.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Perspectivas Latinas is a community service of CAN TV. If your nonprofit organization would like to work with CAN TV, call 312-738-1400 and ask for nonprofit services. Tune into Perspectivas Latinas for local issues and concerns every Thursday at 8:30 p.m. on CAN TV 21. I'm Juan Carlos Hernandez. Thank you for joining us.